Title: The Whispering Shadows. Chapter 1. The Call. The city never slept, and neither did the darkness that haunted it. Detective Ethan Morris had seen it all: the cases, the missing persons, the blood, the violence. But tonight felt different. It wasn't the stifling heat or the hum of distant traffic. It wasn't the grim, fog-covered streets. No, it was something else, something more intangible, something that gnawed at the edges of his awareness like a whispered threat. The call came in around midnight. Morris was sitting at his desk in the dimly lit precinct, his eyes tracing the worn edges of a case file when the phone rang, slicing through the silence. He didn't need to see the caller ID to know it was urgent. His gut told him that. There was something about this particular call that made him feel, for the first time in years, uneasy. The call itself was frantic, desperate, the voice trembling on the other end. "I need help," the woman said, her voice cracking. "There's something in the house, something watching us." He had heard these kinds of calls before, people on the edge of hysteria, imagining threats where none existed. But this woman's tone was different. She was trembling with fear, and the words came out in sharp gasps, as though she was being forced to say them. "Calm down," he said, trying to steady his voice. "What's happening? Are you in immediate danger?" "It's not him," she gasped. "It's not him." "What do you mean?" "I'm not alone, detective," she whispered. I don't know how to explain it. There's something in the house with me, something that's not human." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her shallow breathing. Morris leaned forward, his senses sharpening as the tension in her voice mounted. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice firm. "Where are you right now?" "Near the woods," she replied. "In the old house by the cemetery." Morris froze. That house. He knew the place. A decrepit mansion on the edge of town. It had stood there for as long as anyone could remember, its windows like hollow eyes staring out into the night. The locals whispered about it, how no one had lived there in decades, how strange things happened around it. It was a place of legends, of disappearances and unsolved mysteries. Morris had always dismissed it as superstition, but now, with the woman's voice trembling with raw fear, doubt began to creep into his mind. "I'm coming to you," he said, his voice no longer as confident as before. "Stay on the line, don't hang up." But before she could respond, the call abruptly cut off. Morris cursed under his breath, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. The air felt thick as he walked through the precinct, the usual bustle of officers and phone calls quieted by the gravity of the situation. Outside, the cold wind whipped through the empty streets, and the fog was rolling in thicker than before, a heavy, oppressive mist that clung to the asphalt like a living thing. The drive to the house took longer than he expected, the city's familiar streets swallowed by the encroaching fog. His headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the further he drove, the more isolated he felt. The air grew colder, the usual hum of the city replaced by an unsettling silence, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Finally, the mansion appeared through the haze, its silhouette looming against the fog, like a shadow from a nightmare. Morris parked his car at the base of the long, winding driveway. The house stood at the edge of a forgotten cemetery, the gravestones leaning crookedly under the weight of years and neglect. The wind howled through the trees, their gnarled branches swaying like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. Morris stepped out of the car, his breath misting in the cold night air. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had dealt with worse. He had stared death in the face on countless occasions, but tonight felt different. There was a sense of foreboding, a palpable weight that pressed down on his chest. Something was wrong here, and he could feel it deep in his bones. The front door of the mansion was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. He approached it cautiously, his hand on the grip of his service pistol, ready for whatever waited inside. The door creaked as it opened fully, revealing the dark interior. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and rot. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet as he stepped into the entryway, his flashlight slicing through the blackness. He could see nothing but shadows, shifting and restless in the corners of his vision. "Hello?" he called, his voice carrying through the empty halls. No answer came, but the silence was suffocating, heavy with the weight of the house's history. He moved deeper into the house, his footsteps echoing through the narrow hallways. The walls seemed to close in on him as he walked, the oppressive atmosphere growing with every step. The house felt alive, as though it was watching him, listening. Suddenly, there was a faint sound, a whisper, almost imperceptible. Morris froze, straining to hear. It was a voice, but it wasn't the woman's. It was low, guttural, and incomprehensible, as though it was coming from the very walls themselves. His skin prickled with unease. "Is someone there?" he called again, this time with more urgency. No response, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct, until it was no longer just one voice, but many. Soft, indistinguishable murmurs, as though a crowd of unseen people were speaking in unison, each word drowning the next in a chorus of unintelligible sound. His breath caught in his throat as the whispers seemed to surround him, closing in from every direction. And then, through the haze of whispers, a single word emerged, chilling him to the core. "Leave." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a request. It was a command, spoken with a force that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Morris reached for his radio, his hands trembling. "I need backup," he said, his voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. "Something's wrong. I need—" Before he could finish the sentence, the whispers grew deafening, drowning out his words. The walls seemed to pulse, vibrating with an unnatural energy, as though something unseen was pressing against the very fabric of the house. The temperature dropped, his breath now visible in the air, and he could feel it. Something was watching him, something ancient and malevolent. The woman's voice, trembling and broken, echoed in his mind. "There's something in the house, something watching us." He couldn't explain it. He couldn't understand it. But as the whispers turned into a relentless roar, the weight of the house, the presence that had been watching from the shadows, closed in on him, and Detective Ethan Morris realized that he had made a grave mistake by stepping inside. Part 2. The darkness inside the mansion was a heavy, oppressive presence, pressing against Morris's chest as he stood in the foyer, listening to the echoes of the whispers. His breath quickened, each exhale a small puff in the chilling air. His flashlight flickered as if the very light in the house was being swallowed by the shadows. The whispers, low and fragmented, seemed to seep from every corner, from the very walls themselves, reverberating in the hollow spaces of the house. The voices felt like they were crawling into his mind, settling like an intrusive weight in his thoughts. Morris wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to push through the mounting sense of unease. He had faced danger many times in his career, but nothing like this. He reached for his radio again, but before he could press the button, the whispers became more coherent. They weren't just random murmurs anymore. They were calling his name. "Ethan!" His blood froze in his veins. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakably his name. He spun around, scanning the empty room, his gun still gripped tightly in his hand. But there was no one there. The hallway beyond the foyer was dark, too dark for him to see anything more than vague shapes in the blackness. "Ethan!" The voice came again, this time clearer, more insistent, echoing from the direction of the stairs. The stairs that led to the upper floors, where he had no idea what awaited him. Something in the pit of his stomach twisted with dread. It was the kind of fear that settled deep in his bones, the kind of primal terror that made his instincts scream to run. But he couldn't leave now. He had to know what was happening, had to find the woman and figure out what had brought him to this forsaken place. He stepped forward, his footfalls muted by the dust that had gathered over the years, and approached the staircase. The banister was worn and chipped, the dark wood creaking under the slightest touch. His flashlight beam cut through the dark, illuminating nothing more than the vast emptiness above. The whispers grew louder, a low hum beneath his breath, like a chorus of voices reciting an ancient incantation, their words just out of reach of comprehension. A chill ran down his spine. Something was moving upstairs, a figure, a shadow, or just his imagination running wild. Before he could decide, The sound of a door creaking open upstairs made his heart race. "Who's there?" he thought, his voice trapped in his throat. Without thinking, he rushed up the stairs, the creaking of his boots loud in the silent house. The air was colder here, the darkness almost suffocating. He moved cautiously, his gun raised in front of him as if it could protect him from the unknown. The hallway stretched before him, an endless expanse of shadow and silence. Then, a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, drifted through the air. It was the sound of someone crying. Morris hesitated for a moment, his heartbeat thundering in his chest. Was it the woman, the one who had called him here? He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and began moving toward the sound. He didn't dare to take a single step without careful consideration. The crying grew louder as he approached a door at the end of the hall. A small room. He assumed it was the bedroom, judging by the shape of the door. He reached out, hand trembling, and pushed the door open. The room was empty. Nothing. Not a single thing out of place, except for the thick air. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and discarded. The windows were tightly shut, the blinds drawn, giving the room an eerie sense of confinement. There was no one here, but the crying was still there, echoing from the walls. Now it sounded distorted, like a trapped animal. Morris's mind screamed at him to leave, to turn around and walk out before whatever was happening to him took root, but his body remained frozen. "Leave!" The whisper came again, colder than before, and for a split second, Morris swore he saw something. A figure, in the corner of the room. His flashlight flickered, briefly revealing an outline, a shadowy form that vanished the moment the light shone directly on it. His pulse quickened. That wasn't possible. He hadn't imagined it. He couldn't have. He stepped forward slowly, every muscle in his body alert. But as he neared the corner, the whisper came again. This time, it wasn't a voice. It was a hiss, as if the air itself was speaking, curling around his ears with an almost malicious intent. "You shouldn't have come." Morris froze. The words weren't spoken. They were felt. A pressure on his chest, on his very soul, as if something was clawing at him from within the walls. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a voice. It was something more primal, more ancient than anything he had ever encountered in his career. A sound, like a screeching door opening, pierced the air, cutting through the atmosphere with such intensity that it left a ringing in his ears. The air grew heavier, colder. He turned around abruptly, his flashlight swinging wildly as he searched for the source of the sound. But there was nothing. Just darkness. Just the relentless whispering. And then, in the middle of the silence, the woman's voice broke through, clear and desperate. "He's coming!" Morris turned toward the door, his heart skipping a beat. The words echoed in his head, pounding against his skull. "He's coming!" The room seemed to warp around him, as if the walls themselves were closing in. In the hallway, a figure appeared, outlined in darkness. For a brief second, it seemed almost human, tall and cloaked in shadow. But then the shape distorted, elongated, and Morris's heart plummeted to his stomach. It wasn't human. It was something else, something far worse. He could feel it now. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. It was there, just beyond his reach, watching him. The woman had warned him. Something was here, and it wasn't just in the house. It was in him. The whispers rose again, louder now, overwhelming. "Leave. You shouldn't have come." "He's coming." The words twisted together in a maddening jumble, spinning around him like a whirlwind. And then, the lights flickered. The air went deathly still. A voice, low and guttural, came from the darkness. "You're not leaving." Morris's breath caught in his throat, and the light of his flashlight flickered one last time before plunging him into darkness. His pulse thundered in his ears, the sound drowning out everything else. His heart was pounding like a drum, his hands shaking. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, its form shifting, its edges blurring, and Morris, with no other choice, ran. Chapter 2. The Whispering Silence. The clock on the wall ticked, its rhythmic sound louder than it had any right to be. Each second that passed felt like an eternity as I sat there, staring at the phone in my hand, fingers twitching but never quite daring to press the call button. The words we had exchanged earlier, my own voice, trembling, pleading, still echoed in my mind. A cacophony of questions, suspicions, and fears clashed inside my skull, but one question refused to be drowned out. One question I could not ignore. What really happened during that hostage negotiation? I had been part of the team that handled the incident. It was supposed to be a routine operation, nothing out of the ordinary. But now, sitting in this quiet, sterile office, the weight of the experience seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The negotiation had started as all the others did. There was a tense air of uncertainty, but we were used to it. The hostage-taker, who had been identified as a man named Edward Thompson, had barricaded himself in a small, dingy apartment with 2 hostages. His demands were vague, but we quickly realized that he wasn't after money or freedom. He had something else in mind, something we couldn't comprehend at first. I had spoken to him, tried to reason with him. That was my job, my responsibility. But as I listened to him, something felt wrong, something I couldn't explain. There was a coldness to his voice that made my skin crawl, even over the phone. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even desperate. He was calm, too calm. At first we thought it was a stalling tactic. After all, negotiations were all about patience, right? You played the game, kept the other side talking until they grew tired, until they made a mistake. But Thompson wasn't playing. He wasn't growing tired. He seemed patient, as if he were waiting for something. And then it happened. I still don't know how or why. But when Thompson spoke next, it wasn't him. Not exactly. The voice on the line was wrong, distorted. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was cold, clinical, unnatural, almost mechanical. "Do you hear them?" he asked. I had frozen, unsure of how to respond. "Who?" "The voices," Thompson replied, his tone no longer sounding like the man we'd been negotiating with. "Can't you hear them? They've been with me since the beginning. They won't stop, and neither will I." I tried to make sense of what he was saying, to calm him down, but it was no use. The air around me felt thick with something I couldn't explain, something suffocating, something watching. I could feel my heart pounding as I continued to speak with him, trying to navigate the conversation back to something logical, something concrete. But Thompson's words became more erratic, more disconnected. It was as though he was no longer speaking to me at all. He was speaking to someone else, someone far beyond my comprehension. "I can't leave," he whispered suddenly, his voice breaking. "They won't let me." I glanced at my team, their faces pale, their eyes wide. I wasn't the only one who had noticed the change. The others had begun to mutter under their breath, questioning if we were dealing with something more than a simple hostage situation. Some even began to wonder if there was something supernatural at play, though they would never speak of it out loud. I had heard rumors, whispers about other negotiations gone wrong, about agents hearing strange noises, voices that shouldn't be there. But I never believed in such things, not until now. The line went dead. Thompson's voice was replaced with a deafening silence that made my stomach churn. But something wasn't right. Something, somewhere, was waiting. I could feel it. We had breached the apartment not long after that, but by then, it was too late. Edward Thompson was gone. The hostages were unharmed, but they were different. They didn't speak for days, not a word. When they finally did, their eyes were empty, vacant, as if they had seen something that had taken everything from them. Everything but the hollow shell of their bodies. We were told to forget what happened, to go back to our normal lives as though nothing had changed. But that wasn't possible, not anymore. As I sat there, in the sterile, dimly lit office, I remembered the last words Thompson had said to me before the line cut out. "They're here, and they're never leaving." I put down the phone and rubbed my temples, trying to stave off the creeping panic that had begun to invade my thoughts. The room was too quiet, too still, too heavy. I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. There it was again, that feeling. A low hum in the air, almost imperceptible, but growing louder. A whisper. I stood up, my chair scraping the floor as I made my way to the window. Outside, the city was bathed in an eerie glow from the streetlights. But something was wrong. The world outside seemed distant, hazy. My thoughts were clouded, my vision unfocused. And then, through the haze, I saw it, just for a split second. A figure standing in the distance, half hidden in the shadows. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch impossibly. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, piercing me from the darkness. I blinked, and the figure was gone. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't imagining things. I knew I wasn't. I turned away from the window, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. I needed to call someone, anyone. I needed to make sense of what was happening. But as I reached for it, the phone slipped from my grasp and clattered to the floor, the screen shattering with a sickening crack. And then the whispers began, soft, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but unmistakable. "You should have listened." I froze, my body stiff with fear. The voice was unmistakable. It was Thompson's voice, but it wasn't just him. There were others now. More voices, layered over each other, indistinguishable, overlapping. "They're here," one of the voices whispered again. "And they won't stop until they take you." I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle, but the door wouldn't open. It was stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. I pulled harder, panic rising in my chest, but still, it wouldn't budge. "You're too late," a voice crooned from the shadows behind me. I turned, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart racing. The figure was there again, standing in the doorway. It was closer now, its presence looming, suffocating. I tried to scream, but the words died in my throat, replaced by a suffocating silence. The air around me grew cold, icy even, as if the very life was being sucked from the room. "We're waiting," the voice whispered, and everything went black. Chapter 2. The Whispering Silence, Part 2. I awoke with a start, gasping for air, my body trembling as if I had just been submerged in freezing water. My hands shot out to grab the edge of the desk, steadying myself, as if I could ground myself to the reality that felt so distant now. The room was dark, suffused with the faint glow of the streetlights outside. It was still the same office, the same sterile environment, the same uncomfortably quiet atmosphere, but something had changed. My breath came in ragged gasps as I looked around. Unsure of where I was, there was no sound, no movement, just that pressing, suffocating silence. The clock on the wall ticked again, but it sounded far more ominous than before, like a countdown to something terrible. The phone lay on the floor, the screen shattered, but something caught my eye. The shattered pieces of glass glowed faintly in the darkness, as if they held some kind of energy, something beyond the mundane. I had to pick it up. I had to understand. I crawled toward the phone, my knees scraping against the cold floor. My hands were shaking as I reached for it. But when I touched the broken screen, a strange sensation ran through my fingers. It was as though the glass was alive, pulsing with a strange, cold energy. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Could it be a power surge? Was the phone somehow malfunctioning? But no, it wasn't the phone. It was something deeper, something far more malevolent that had made its way into the room with me. A soft whisper, barely audible, danced at the edge of my hearing, like a soft breeze brushing against my ear. I tried to ignore it, but it felt like fingers grazing my skin, cold and unsettling. "Not yet. Not yet. Not yet." The voice was faint at first, almost like a lullaby, but as I listened it grew louder, its words becoming clearer, sharper. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a command, a warning. I stood up quickly, shaking the sensation from my mind. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. I was just overworked, stressed from the past few days. I had to get out of this office, get some air. I needed to clear my head, but the feeling of being watched, it didn't go away. I approached the window again, peering out into the city streets. The glow of the streetlights had become more pronounced, casting long shadows across the pavement, creating an eerie atmosphere that seemed unnatural, even for the dead of night. I couldn't see anyone, not a soul. Yet the feeling of being observed pressed in on me, relentless, suffocating. The whispers came again. This time they were clearer, louder, more insistent. "You're not alone." I turned sharply, my heart pounding in my chest. The office seemed to stretch and warp before me, the walls seeming to pulse with the force of something unseen. It was as though reality itself was beginning to slip, crumbling at the edges. I staggered back, trying to steady myself, my hand grasping at the desk. My head spun. Sweat slicked my brow as I fought to breathe. I was hyper-aware of the space around me, the oppressive silence, the broken phone lying on the floor like an omen. The weight of the darkness around me seemed unbearable, crushing. And then I heard it. Footsteps, soft at first, almost inaudible, but they grew louder, closer. Each step sent a cold shiver down my spine, as if the very air was being sucked away, replaced by something darker, something that thrived in the dark. I turned toward the door, but it remained closed, locked. My eyes darted around the room. The shadows seemed to move. The faint outline of a figure appeared at the edge of my vision, just a silhouette, standing in the corner. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretching unnaturally. I felt its presence before I even saw it clearly, felt its eyes on me, watching me, waiting. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was like a cold breeze curling around my thoughts, drowning out the panic rising in my chest. The words didn't just come from the figure, it seemed to come from everywhere, from the very walls, from the floor beneath me. I could feel it wrapping around me, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. "Who are you?" I croaked, my voice trembling. My throat felt tight, as though it were closing around me. The figure stepped closer, its silhouette growing more defined. Its face was obscured by shadows, but the eyes, those eyes, glowed faintly, cold and empty, like black pits in the dark. They pierced into me, unblinking, relentless. The voice, no, it was more than a voice now, whispered in my mind. "You've seen too much. You've heard too much. You can't leave." I felt the room closing in, the walls pressing against me, suffocating me. My pulse thudded in my ears, and all I could hear was the constant whispering. The footsteps had stopped, but the air was thick with anticipation, like something was about to break, like someone, was waiting for me to make the wrong move. I backed away slowly, my hands reaching for anything to steady myself. My fingers brushed against the desk again, the cold surface grounding me for a moment. But the figure in the corner remained, its gaze unyielding, its presence overwhelming. "You won't escape," it whispered, its voice a dark lullaby. "You never will." I knew, deep in my gut, that it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. I turned sharply, but there was no way out. The door remained shut, locked. I glanced toward the window, but the streetlights outside seemed to flicker, casting long, twisted shadows that danced around like living things. I was trapped. No matter what I did, no matter how I tried to escape, the room closed in on me, suffocating me. And then, in the stillness of that oppressive silence, I heard something I didn't expect. A phone ringing. My heart skipped a beat, my head snapping toward the noise. The phone on the desk was ringing. But how? I had already shattered it. I had thrown it on the floor. There was no way it should still be functioning. The sound of the ring grew louder, echoing through the room like a death knell. I stood frozen, unable to move. The figure in the corner remained still, watching, waiting. I couldn't answer it. I couldn't pick it up, but something inside me screamed that I had no choice. I reached out slowly, trembling, and grabbed the phone. As my fingers closed around it, the ringing stopped abruptly, replaced by a hollow silence. I stared at the shattered screen. It was cracked, still glowing faintly, but something was different. There, on the screen, was a message. "I told you not to come." Before I could react, The shadows in the room shifted, and the whispering began again. Closer this time. Louder. "You've seen too much," the voice hissed. "And now you're ours." The last thing I saw before the world went black was the glowing eyes of the figure in the corner, closer now, its face stretching into a grotesque smile. Chapter 3. The Haunting Echo, Part 1. The phone call lingered in my mind, its meaning more elusive than ever. I had replayed the message in my head over and over, each repetition unraveling something deeper, something darker that I couldn't fully grasp. The words were simple, but they carried weight. A suffocating weight that pressed against my chest and constricted my thoughts. "I told you not to come." They echoed in my head, like the fading rumble of thunder, each syllable a warning I couldn't ignore. But still, I couldn't make sense of it. Why me? Why this office? What had I stumbled upon that was so forbidden? Was it the phone, the messages on the shattered screen, or was it something far more insidious, something hidden beneath the surface, waiting for me to discover it? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed, that every step I took brought me closer to something I was never meant to uncover. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of dread that crept under my skin. The room seemed colder now, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my nerves, but when I opened them again, something had changed. The shadows were deeper, stretching unnaturally across the walls, as if they had taken on a life of their own. A strange humming sound filled the air, distant at first, but growing louder, vibrating against the walls. It was almost as if the room itself was alive. I glanced at the door. The lock was still intact, but the feeling of being trapped, of being unable to escape, was inescapable. I approached the door slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle, but before I could turn it, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment. In that moment, the humming ceased, replaced by a cold, suffocating silence that clung to me like a shroud. My heart raced as I stood motionless, my breath shallow. The darkness pressed in on me from all sides, suffocating and impenetrable. Whispering, a faint sound, barely perceptible at first, but it was there, at the edges of my hearing, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I felt it wrap around me, cold fingers slipping across my skin, and I froze, every muscle in my body tense. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice caught in my throat, as though the words were being smothered before they could escape. The whisper grew louder, clearer, like a chant reverberating in the walls. Each word felt like it was carved into my soul, a declaration that had no beginning and no end. "You shouldn't have come. You can't leave." A surge of terror flooded my chest. The room spun around me, distorting as the shadows grew more pronounced, darker, twisting in unnatural patterns. I felt my knees give out as the weight of it all pressed down on me, and I stumbled, landing hard against the floor. The cold of the tiles seeped into my skin, but it was nothing compared to the cold that spread through my chest. Then, silence. I lay there, my eyes wide, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what was happening. The whispering had stopped, but I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it in the very air, in the oppressive stillness that now hung like a death sentence. Slowly, cautiously, I pulled myself to my feet and stumbled toward the desk, my hands trembling as I reached for the phone again. It lay where I had dropped it, shattered and cracked, yet somehow still glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. It felt like a portal, an open invitation to something beyond this world, a place where I was no longer in control. The screen flickered, and the same message appeared once more. "I told you not to come." But this time, there was something else, something new, something that had been added to the message. A series of numbers, cryptic, nonsensical, yet somehow familiar. 53 12 09 117. My pulse quickened as I stared at the screen, the numbers searing into my mind. They were like a code, an encrypted message that I couldn't decipher, but I knew, deep down, I knew, that I had to figure it out. It was the key to understanding what was happening to me, what was happening in this cursed place. I backed away from the desk, the overwhelming sense of dread pressing down on me, but I couldn't leave. I couldn't move. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the shadows seemed to be growing thicker, more solid. The faintest trace of movement in the corner of my vision caught my attention, and I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing, just the room, empty as ever. But the silence felt wrong. It wasn't the comforting silence of an empty office. It was a suffocating silence that carried with it the weight of something much darker, something that wanted to be heard but was too afraid to speak. And then, as if on cue, the phone rang again. I froze. My eyes darted to the device on the desk. The ringing grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't bring myself to pick it up. I knew what would happen if I answered. Something was waiting on the other side of that call, something that had been calling to me from the very moment I stepped into this cursed place. The ringing continued, louder and louder, until it felt like the entire room was vibrating with the force of it. And then, suddenly, everything went quiet. Too quiet. So quiet that it felt like the world had stopped, like time itself had frozen in place. I reached for the phone. The moment my fingers touched it, a cold jolt of energy surged through my body, sending a shockwave through every fiber of my being. My vision blurred as the phone seemed to pulse in my hand. And then, without warning, the screen came to life again. "Do you see it now?" The words flashed across the screen, accompanied by the same cryptic numbers. Vitamin 1209, 17. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every beat reverberating in my ears. It was the only sound I could hear now, the only thing that mattered. Without thinking, I typed the numbers into the phone. 53, 12, 09, 17. The phone flickered, and the world around me seemed to shudder. The air grew cold, and I felt my skin tighten, as though it was stretching to accommodate something unseen. The shadows began to move again, but this time, they weren't just shifting. They were alive, crawling along the walls, reaching for me, pulling at me. And then, a voice. Not a whisper this time, but a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. "You shouldn't have come, and now you can't leave." The phone dropped from my hand, crashing to the floor as the shadows reached out, wrapping around me, pulling me into the darkness. Chapter 4. Beneath the surface. The office was no longer just an office. When I had arrived that morning, it had been a typical workplace, full of the hum of machinery and the soft murmur of colleagues hunched over their tasks. But now, after everything that had happened, it was something else entirely. A hollow shell, a prison of echoes and whispers. The walls that once stood as silent sentinels now seemed alive, as though the very foundation of the building had become a sentient entity, aware of my every move. I knew something was wrong the moment the door clicked shut behind me. It wasn't the fact that the room was empty. I had expected that. People had come and gone, leaving behind a trail of paper, coffee cups, and forgotten memories. But today it was different. There was a heavy stillness in the air, like the calm before a storm, or perhaps the calm after. I couldn't tell any more. It was as if time itself had become tangled within these walls, stretched and broken beyond recognition. The silence was suffocating. I had tried to call my colleague, Jenna, but the phone line had been cut. No dial tone. Just a soft, distorted hum that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of my bones. I had left her a message, but it felt as though my voice was swallowed up by the void before it could even reach her. I glanced around the room, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering sporadically, casting long, ghostly shadows across the floor. The desk sat at the far side of the room, the same desk I had sat at just hours earlier. The chair, its worn leather creaking under the weight of 1,000 hours of use, was still there, but it felt different now. It felt waiting. I shuddered and took a few steps toward it, my shoes tapping softly on the floor, echoing off the empty walls. The drawers were still locked, the surface untouched, but something felt wrong about this stillness. Something was missing. Where are they? The question hung in the air like a taunting whisper, and I felt a pang of unease tighten in my chest. I leaned over the desk and picked up the crumpled papers scattered across the surface, my fingers brushing against a few half-empty coffee cups, each one cold to the touch. The papers, just routine files, mundane reports from the day before, felt out of place. They should have been filed away by now, processed and forgotten. But instead, they were still there, as though they had been abandoned in haste. Like someone had left them behind in their flight from something they couldn't explain. I froze. Among the scattered papers, there was something new. It was a small, dark envelope, a thick, wax seal stamped onto the flap. The symbol of an unfamiliar design, some kind of ornate twisting pattern. The edges were ragged, the ink on the seal smeared, as though it had been pressed too hard. My pulse quickened as I reached for it, the letter beckoning me like a spider's web. I tore open the seal, my hands trembling. The paper inside was thick, and the words written on it were strange. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, the ink smeared in places where the writer's hand had likely trembled with haste. You shouldn't have come. You can't leave now, not after what you've seen. The words echoed in my mind as I read them over and over. A warning, a threat. But it was the last line that sent a cold shiver down my spine. The door is locked, but you're not alone. The walls are listening, and they're waiting for you. I dropped the letter, the words searing into my mind like a branding iron. My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed away from the desk, the room closing in on me. My skin felt tight, as if I had been thrust into a nightmare I couldn't escape. What was happening here? Suddenly I felt it. The shift. A presence. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that defied logic. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, visions flickering in the corner of my mind. But when I blinked, the shapes remained, hovering just beyond the edge of the room, their forms indistinct and constantly shifting. It wasn't just the shadows. It was the air itself, thick, heavy, as though the room had become soaked with something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching. I spun around, my breath quickening as I tried to orient myself. The window was open. How had that happened? I was certain it had been closed when I arrived. I rushed over to it, my hand brushing the edge of the sill, but the cool breeze that filtered through the gap was wrong, too cold, as if it had come from somewhere beyond this world. A soft tapping. It started as a distant sound, muffled by the thickness of the walls. But then, it grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. My heart skipped a beat as I turned around. The door. It was rattling, as if something, or someone, was on the other side, trying to break through. I had to leave. I rushed to the door, my hands fumbling with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, no matter how much I pulled. It was as though the door itself was resisting my touch. The walls are listening. The words from the letter echoed again, louder this time, reverberating through my skull. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but there was no response. Just the eerie tap-tap-tapping from the other side, as if whatever was waiting on the other side was enjoying my panic, savoring my helplessness. My breath became shallow, panic setting in as the room seemed to grow darker. The shadows pressed closer, swirling around me like a thick fog, suffocating and oppressive. And then, as if on cue, the tapping stopped. An unnatural stillness took its place, and for a moment I thought I was imagining it. But then I heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper carried by the wind. It was coming from the walls, from the cracks in the ceiling. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to hear. "We see you." The words were soft, barely audible, but they froze me in place. I felt as though the walls themselves were speaking to me, their ancient voices rising from deep within the building's foundation. And then the whisper grew louder. "You're not supposed to be here. You've disturbed us. And now, you'll never leave." The darkness in the room thickened, swirling around me like a living thing, suffocating and consuming everything in its path. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned, desperate for any escape. But there was none. The walls were closing in, the shadows stretching toward me like claws. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, stifled by the pressure building in the room. It was as though the very air itself had become a prison, suffocating me with each breath. And then, the room went silent. Everything stopped. I looked around in a daze, my body frozen in place, my heart racing. The shadows had retreated, the room once again eerily still, but something was different. I could feel it. Something had changed. They were here. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. The walls were listening. The walls were watching. And I was no longer alone. Chapter 4. Beneath the Surface. The office was no longer just an office. When I had arrived that morning, it had been a typical workplace, full of the hum of machinery and the soft murmur of colleagues hunched over their tasks. But now, after everything that had happened, it was something else entirely. A hollow shell, a prison of echoes and whispers. The walls that once stood as silent sentinels now seemed alive, as though the very foundation of the building had become a sentient entity, aware of my every move. I knew something was wrong the moment the door clicked shut behind me. It wasn't the fact that the room was empty. I had expected that. People had come and gone, leaving behind a trail of paper, coffee cups, and forgotten memories. But today it was different. There was a heavy stillness in the air, like the calm before a storm, or perhaps the calm after. I couldn't tell any more. It was as if time itself had become tangled within these walls, stretched and broken beyond recognition. The silence was suffocating. I had tried to call my colleague, Jenna, but the phone line had been cut. No dial tone. Just a soft, distorted hum that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of my bones. I had left her a message, but it felt as though my voice was swallowed up by the void before it could even reach her. I glanced around the room, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering sporadically, casting long, ghostly shadows across the floor. The desk sat at the far side of the room, the same desk I had sat at just hours earlier. The chair, its worn leather creaking under the weight of 1,000 hours of use, was still there, but it felt different now. It felt waiting. I shuddered and took a few steps toward it, my shoes tapping softly on the floor, echoing off the empty walls. The drawers were still locked, the surface untouched, but something felt wrong about this stillness. Something was missing. Where are they? The question hung in the air like a taunting whisper, and I felt a pang of unease tighten in my chest. I leaned over the desk and picked up the crumpled papers scattered across the surface, my fingers brushing against a few half-empty coffee cups, each one cold to the touch. The papers, just routine files, mundane reports from the day before, felt out of place. They should have been filed away by now, processed and forgotten. But instead, they were still there, as though they had been abandoned in haste. Like someone had left them behind in their flight from something they couldn't explain. I froze. Among the scattered papers, there was something new. It was a small, dark envelope, a thick, wax seal stamped onto the flap. The symbol of an unfamiliar design, some kind of ornate twisting pattern. The edges were ragged, the ink on the seal smeared, as though it had been pressed too hard. My pulse quickened as I reached for it, the letter beckoning me like a spider's web. I tore open the seal, my hands trembling. The paper inside was thick, and the words written on it were strange. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, the ink smeared in places where the writer's hand had likely trembled with haste. You shouldn't have come. You can't leave now, not after what you've seen. The words echoed in my mind as I read them over and over. A warning, a threat. But it was the last line that sent a cold shiver down my spine. The door is locked, but you're not alone. The walls are listening, and they're waiting for you. I dropped the letter, the words searing into my mind like a branding iron. My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed away from the desk, the room closing in on me. My skin felt tight, as if I had been thrust into a nightmare I couldn't escape. What was happening here? Suddenly I felt it. The shift. A presence. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that defied logic. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, visions flickering in the corner of my mind. But when I blinked, the shapes remained, hovering just beyond the edge of the room, their forms indistinct and constantly shifting. It wasn't just the shadows. It was the air itself, thick, heavy, as though the room had become soaked with something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching. I spun around, my breath quickening as I tried to orient myself. The window was open. How had that happened? I was certain it had been closed when I arrived. I rushed over to it, my hand brushing the edge of the sill, but the cool breeze that filtered through the gap was wrong, too cold, as if it had come from somewhere beyond this world. A soft tapping. It started as a distant sound, muffled by the thickness of the walls. But then, it grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. My heart skipped a beat as I turned around. The door. It was rattling, as if something, or someone, was on the other side, trying to break through. I had to leave. I rushed to the door, my hands fumbling with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, no matter how much I pulled. It was as though the door itself was resisting my touch. The walls are listening. The words from the letter echoed again, louder this time, reverberating through my skull. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but there was no response. Just the eerie tap-tap-tapping from the other side, as if whatever was waiting on the other side was enjoying my panic, savoring my helplessness. My breath became shallow, panic setting in as the room seemed to grow darker. The shadows pressed closer, swirling around me like a thick fog, suffocating and oppressive. And then, as if on cue, the tapping stopped. An unnatural stillness took its place, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining it. But then I heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper carried by the wind. It was coming from the walls, from the cracks in the ceiling. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to hear. "We see you." The words were soft, barely audible, but they froze me in place. I felt as though the walls themselves were speaking to me, their ancient voices rising from deep within the building's foundation. And then the whisper grew louder. "You're not supposed to be here. You've disturbed us, and now you'll never leave." The darkness in the room thickened, swirling around me like a living thing, suffocating and consuming everything in its path. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned, desperate for any escape. But there was none. The walls were closing in, the shadows stretching toward me like claws. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, stifled by the pressure building in the room. It was as though the very air itself had become a prison, suffocating me with each breath. And then, the room went silent. Everything stopped. I looked around in a daze, my body frozen in place, my heart racing. The shadows had retreated, the room once again eerily still. But something was different. I could feel it. Something had changed. They were here. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. The walls were listening. The walls were watching. And I was no longer alone. This expansion builds on the eerie atmosphere and sense of dread, weaving in elements of the supernatural and psychological horror. The tension grows as the character struggles with the creeping sense that something is wrong, but the true terror remains just out of reach, creating an unnerving feeling of isolation. Would you like to continue exploring the story, or is there a specific direction you wanted to go? 4. Banjan Noi. Viet va fatrien them chomach truyen qua chuong paj kwang 44 son chu. Kong Viet laple noi dango kat chuong. Giong van mang tin vin tuong. Mami, kindi Viet bang tiengan. ChatGPT Jan Noi. ChatGPT to develop. Chapter 5. With a haunting, eerie and supernatural tone, we can continue with the progression of tension and unease, deepening the mysteries that were seeded in earlier chapters. The goal is to escalate the sense of dread and suspense as the story moves forward. Below is a continuation and expansion for Chapter 5. Chapter 5. The Echoes of Silence. The room was suffocating, not from physical confinement, but from the heavy weight of something unseen. The very air seemed to pulse, filled with the faintest hum, like the last breath of a dying thing. I could feel it in my bones, a relentless, creeping presence, something lurking just beyond the edge of my perception. I sat at my desk, motionless, staring at the letter that had appeared earlier. The words still burned in my mind, even though I had long since discarded it. The cryptic warning, the chilling message. It felt like a curse, one I couldn't escape from. You shouldn't have come. You can't leave now. Not after what you've seen. The words resonated, repeating in my thoughts, reverberating against the walls of my skull. They were a constant, gnawing reminder of something much worse than I had ever feared. My throat tightened at the thought that whatever it was that had taken hold of this place, it was watching, waiting. It knew I was here, and it had no intention of letting me go. I glanced around the room again, feeling the oppressive weight of the silence. It had been hours, maybe days, since anyone had come by. The door was still locked, the windows sealed. There were no sounds outside. The office was isolated, as if suspended in time. The world beyond its walls felt distant, unreachable. The shadows seemed deeper now. The corners of the room grew darker, though no lights were out of place. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their hum a constant companion to the unnerving quiet. Yet the darkness wasn't just in the corners. It was in the air, pooling and gathering like thick fog, an invisible presence that seemed to breathe along with me. It was then that I heard it again. The tapping, that soft rhythmic sound. It was no longer distant, no longer faint. It was coming from within the room itself. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood, instinctively moving towards the source. It was as if the noise were guiding me, drawing me closer, its pattern now unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. With each sound, my pulse quickened, and the room felt smaller, more suffocating. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pressed my palm to the wall, hoping to still the sensation in my chest. But the wall felt different. It was colder than it should have been, an unnatural chill that sank deep into my skin, numbing my fingers. And then, as I moved my hand across the surface, I felt it. A slight shift beneath the wallpaper. A seam. It was almost imperceptible, like a crack that had been hidden for years. But now that I had found it, it felt impossibly wrong. The wallpaper was slightly torn in places, and I could feel the faintest draft coming from behind it. Something was hidden there, something I wasn't supposed to find. I pulled at the corner of the paper with trembling hands, tearing it away, revealing a small, narrow passageway. The walls behind it were bare, damp, covered in shadows that seemed to ripple and pulse with the slightest movement. It felt as though the darkness itself was alive, reacting to my presence. I hesitated, my breath shallow in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to turn away, to leave this room and never come back. But curiosity, mingled with fear, held me in place. What was behind this hidden door? What was waiting for me? I took a step forward, then another, until I found myself standing at the opening. The air beyond the wall was thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature had dropped several degrees. The faintest echo seemed to come from the dark passageway, like whispers of voices long gone. There was something else too. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, distant but growing nearer. A soft scrape against the floor, as if someone, was moving towards me. My breath caught in my throat as the shadows shifted before me, swirling and reforming in shapes I couldn't comprehend. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I stood frozen, my skin crawling, every nerve on edge. It was as though the world had gone still, holding its breath. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everything seemed to be watching me now. The very air seemed to pulse with a malevolent awareness, as though something was waiting for me to make the wrong move. I stepped backward, my shoes scraping against the floor. That was when I saw it, the reflection. The walls were not bare as I had originally thought. There was someone, staring back at me from the darkened glass. A figure shrouded in shadows, its face distorted and yet eerily familiar. It was like staring into a warped mirror, but the reflection didn't match my own. I stumbled back, my hands flying to my face as I gasped for air. The figure's eyes, black and hollow, stared into me, as if they knew my every fear, every secret. It was more than a reflection. It was a presence, an entity that existed on the other side of the glass, in the space between here and somewhere else. I backed away, stumbling as the air seemed to close in around me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came again, louder this time, from inside the room. It was no longer a distant noise, but something that echoed in my very bones. The walls groaned, shifting, as if they were alive, and I could hear the whispers growing louder in the air around me. I couldn't stand it any longer. My mind was reeling, my senses overwhelmed by the unbearable weight of the unknown. I ran. I turned away from the passage, from the figure that haunted me, and dashed for the door. My hands fumbled with the handle, desperately trying to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. No matter how hard I tried, it remained firmly shut. The shadows pressed in tighter, wrapping around me like 1,000 hands. The whispers filled my ears, each one louder than the last. And in the dark corners of the room, the figure, its eyes still fixed on me, moved closer, its distorted form bending and twisting unnaturally. I screamed, but no sound escaped. I was trapped, and I was no longer alone. Chapter 6. The hollow beneath the room had not changed, but I had. The shadows had grown longer, and the silence had turned into something palpable, like a thick fog wrapping itself around me. My mind raced in every direction, struggling to make sense of the images that haunted me, the distorted reflection, the whispering walls, the footsteps that never seemed to belong to anyone. It had been days, weeks, perhaps even longer, since I had last seen another living soul. Time had become meaningless. I could no longer tell if the sun was rising or setting. I could not even be certain that I was still within the same building I had started in. The structure around me had become a labyrinth, each corridor leading deeper into a darkness I could not escape. The door that had once been my only hope for freedom now felt like the last barrier between me and the abyss that threatened to consume me. But every time I reached for it, my fingers trembling with desperate anticipation, it refused to open. Locked. Always locked. The walls felt closer now, as though they were alive, breathing in sync with me. I could almost hear their pulse beneath the surface, a rhythmic thrumming that matched the pounding in my chest. The tapping from within the walls had intensified, growing more erratic, more frantic. It was as if the building itself was urging me to listen, to understand something I could not yet grasp. And then I heard it again. The whispering. It came from the walls, from the cracks in the floor, from the shadows that stretched unnaturally long. The whispers were not in any language I recognized. They were guttural, hollow sounds that vibrated in the air like a distant, dying chant. It was a language older than time, one that twisted my thoughts and filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I had tried to ignore it at first, but now the whispers were impossible to shut out. They circled around me, insistent, persistent, like a swarm of insects in my ears. "It's time," they murmured, over and over. "It's time. You must see the truth." I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the incessant sound, but it only grew louder, more intense. The walls around me seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the whispers, as if they were alive, breathing, waiting. The air itself felt heavier, thicker, as though something was moving within it, something ancient, malevolent. And then, there it was, the sensation that I had been dreading, the sensation that it was near. A cold wind brushed against my neck, sending shivers down my spine. My skin crawled as I slowly turned around. My breath caught in my throat. In the corner of the room, just beyond the threshold of where the shadows gathered, there was a figure. Not a human figure. Something far worse. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape twisted and contorted as though it had been formed from the very shadows themselves. Its body was elongated, impossibly thin, and its skin, or whatever passed for skin, was a mottled grey, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. It had no face, only a void where its features should have been. But there was a presence, an awful, suffocating presence, radiating from it. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My legs felt as though they were rooted to the floor, frozen in place by the sight of the thing that stood before me. The figure tilted its head, as though it could sense my fear. It moved slowly, deliberately, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it advanced toward me. The air grew colder with each step it took, until I could see my breath fogging in front of me, despite the lack of a breeze. It spoke then. The voice was not a voice at all, but a sound, a rasping, scraping sound that reverberated inside my skull, rattling my bones. I could feel it in my teeth, in my blood. You are not meant to be here. The words slid into my mind like a parasite, burrowing deep into my consciousness. They made no sense, yet I understood them perfectly. I wasn't supposed to be here. But what was here? What was this place? What was it that was so desperately trying to keep me locked inside? Before I could react, the figure raised its hand, a long, bony appendage that seemed to stretch and grow, as though it were reaching for something deep beneath the earth. The room grew darker, the shadows swallowing everything in sight. The figure's hand moved closer, its fingers impossibly long, and with one swift motion, it grabbed my arm, pulling me toward it. I could feel its cold grip, its fingers digging into my flesh, pulling me closer. And in that moment, I felt the weight of all the years this thing had been waiting, all the centuries of hunger, of thirst, of longing for something, someone, to be in this place. A place that existed not just outside of time, but outside of reality itself. I fought back, struggling to break free, but it was no use. The thing's grip tightened, and I was dragged further into the shadows. I could feel the walls pressing in around me, crushing me with their weight, as if they were alive, as if they were part of this thing. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the figure released me. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The figure loomed above me, its form undulating, shifting in ways that defied all logic. It opened its mouth then. Not that it had a mouth in the traditional sense, but the space where its face should have been split open, revealing a gaping maw that seemed to stretch for eternity. And from within that abyss, a sound emerged, a sound like 1,000 voices screaming at once. You will never leave. The words were a curse, a promise, and a sentence all at once. I could feel them, like chains wrapped around my soul, tightening with every passing second. The walls closed in tighter still, the shadows growing thicker, darker, until there was nothing left but the thing that towered over me, its empty gaze fixed on me like a predator waiting to feast. I closed my eyes, not out of defeat, but because I could no longer bear to look at what was before me. My mind, my very sanity, was unraveling. The whispers, the shadows, the figure, they were all part of the same nightmare, a nightmare that had no end. I could feel the fabric of reality itself tearing apart around me. I was lost. Chapter 7. The Echoes of Silence. The silence was the loudest sound in the room. It pulsed in my ears, each breath a slow, suffocating draw, as though the air itself was growing thick, refusing to move. I stood at the threshold of the room, trembling, every instinct in my body telling me to flee, to turn around and escape this place that had already claimed so much of my soul. But there was no turning back now. I had passed through the doors before me too many times, each entry carrying me deeper into this maze that was no longer simply a building. It was something else now, a living thing. It watched me, studied my every move. It was aware of my presence, and it was waiting for me to understand. The walls seemed to press in closer with each step I took, their ancient stones whispering to each other in a language I could never hope to understand. The echoes were no longer distant, reverberating only in my mind. They filled the space, curling and twisting in the dark corners, echoing louder and louder with every breath I took. It was the kind of silence that spoke to you, the kind of silence that gnawed at your thoughts and suffocated your sanity. I could hear it now. The whispers were no longer a murmur. They were words, clear and insistent, yet carried in a voice that was not a voice at all. It was the sound of the building itself speaking, hissing through cracks in the floor, slipping through the seams in the doorframe. Come closer, it beckoned. The truth is waiting for you. I stepped forward. The floor creaked beneath my feet, a sound like bones snapping underfoot. The darkness around me pressed tighter, suffocating, as though the room itself had no intention of letting me leave. And yet, despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I couldn't resist. There was something in that whisper, something so maddeningly familiar, like a memory I had long buried beneath layers of time. I stepped deeper into the room, my fingers brushing against the walls. The stones were cold, rough against my skin, but there was something more, something that moved beneath the surface. A pulse, a tremor, a heartbeat. The room around me seemed to stretch out, distorting, twisting like a fever dream. Shadows shifted and danced, flickering at the edges of my vision, darting just out of sight. But they weren't shadows. They were shapes, human shapes. I could see them now, their outlines forming against the darkness. Figures, hunched and twisted, their limbs unnaturally elongated, their faces blank slates of forgotten horrors. They were watching me. The air around me grew colder, a chill that seeped into my bones, stealing away my warmth. I could feel their presence, feel them move closer, but they didn't touch me. They didn't need to. Their mere proximity was enough to freeze me in place, to trap me in the nightmare I had found myself in. Do you see them? The whispers coiled around me again, wrapping tighter. Do you understand now? They've been waiting for you to come home. Home. I wanted to scream, to run from the madness, but my throat was tight, my chest heavy with the weight of unspeakable knowledge. They had been waiting. They had always been waiting. But for what? What was I meant to find here? I couldn't answer. My mind was a tangle of thoughts, of confusion, of raw terror that threatened to consume me whole. The figures in the room were closing in now, their silhouettes shifting as they moved toward me. The darkness swirled around them like a living thing, licking at the edges of their forms, obscuring their features. And then I saw it, a door. At the far end of the room, a door I had never noticed before. It was an odd thing, half hidden in shadow, its frame warped and bent as if time had bent it to its will. The door was the only light in the room, faintly glowing with an ethereal luminescence that felt wrong. It called to me, beckoning me forward like a siren's song. Without thinking, my feet carried me toward it. The figures didn't stop me. They watched, but they didn't move. The door was the only thing that mattered now, the only thing I could see clearly in the growing fog of my thoughts. I reached for the door, my hand shaking. The moment my fingers brushed against the handle, the world shifted again. The shadows around me twisted violently, like something was breaking apart, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn. A scream, my scream, ripped from my throat as the darkness consumed me whole. The room vanished, the figures vanished, the silence vanished, and I fell. I landed with a thud that echoed through my skull. I struggled to push myself up. My vision blurred. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay heavy in my nostrils. I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of the world around me, but it felt wrong. Too still, too silent. The faintest trace of light filtered through cracks in the ceiling, casting long, trembling shadows across the room. The walls here were crumbling, their surfaces coated in mildew and grime. And then I realized I was no longer in the building. I wasn't even sure if I was in the same dimension. This place, whatever it was, felt different. The atmosphere was oppressive, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. I could feel it now, swirling around me, touching my skin like cold fingers. It was as if I was surrounded by something ancient, something that had never been meant to be seen by human eyes. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to find my way out, but I couldn't. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. A sound, a faint scuffling, caught my attention. I froze. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, the echo of my own footsteps, but the sound came again, sharper this time, closer. Something, or someone, was in the room with me. I turned slowly, heart hammering in my chest. The room was still empty. No figures, no movement. But then I saw it, a shadow creeping along the far wall. It slithered, not like a human form, but like something far more sinister. It writhed and contorted, its edges blurring as though it were never meant to exist. I could feel it watching me. I took a step back, but my foot caught on something soft. My eyes darted downward, and I gasped. It was a body, a lifeless body, its limbs twisted in unnatural ways. The skin was pale and stretched tight, the eyes wide open in terror, staring at nothing. I recoiled, my stomach churning, but it was too late. The shadow surged toward me. Part 2. The shadow came at me with an unnerving speed, a dark, writhing mass that seemed to stretch and pull, like it was being dragged from the very edges of reality. There was no sound as it moved, only the sensation of a presence in the air, a pressure that squeezed the breath from my lungs. It was not a thing, but a force. It was not alive, but it felt alive, like a predator that thrived on fear and darkness. I stumbled back, my feet uncoordinated as I tried to push myself further away from the shadow, but the room seemed to grow tighter with each movement. The walls, once distant, now pressed against me, forcing me toward the center of the room, toward that thing. The light from the crack in the ceiling flickered, growing dimmer as if even the very atmosphere recoiled from what was about to happen. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I had come here searching for something, seeking to uncover the secrets hidden in this forsaken place. But now, in the face of this monstrous force, I questioned everything. What was I looking for? What had driven me to push this far? My heartbeat hammered in my chest, deafening in my ears. I couldn't think. My mind was a swirl of panic and confusion. I reached for the nearest object, anything to defend myself. But there was nothing, only the decaying remnants of what this place once was, hollow and forsaken. The shadow moved again, coiling like a serpent, slithering closer, filling the space with its suffocating presence. I could feel it now, close enough that I could almost hear it breathing, if it even had lungs. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the weight of its presence pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe, to think. The cold seeped into my bones, deeper than any physical chill, as if this thing knew every weakness of my body, every fear I had buried deep. Run! The command shot through my mind like a jolt of electricity, and without thinking I spun around, desperate to escape. But the room didn't let me go. The walls, now solid and unforgiving, seemed to close in. The door I had seen earlier, the one that had beckoned me, was now a distant memory. No matter how I turned, no matter how fast I ran, there was no way out. I was trapped. I collapsed to the floor, my hands scraping against the cold, hard stone. I could hear it now, a low, guttural noise, like a whisper rising from the depths of the earth itself. The sound was both distant and close at the same time, swirling around me. Within me, I felt as though I were drowning in it. The shadow seemed to pause, lingering in the air just beyond my reach, as though it were toying with me, savoring the fear in my heart. Its shape flickered, growing larger, then smaller, its form twisting in unnatural ways. It shifted, blending with the very shadows around me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something else in its depths. A face. Not a human face, but something far older, something twisted. Its eyes were hollow voids, endless pits that seemed to pull at my very soul. The mouth, if it could be called a mouth, was an unnatural slit stretched across the face, a jagged line that never seemed to close, never seemed to stop. And it smiled, a terrible, knowing smile. The weight of it pressed down harder on my chest, suffocating, constricting. My breaths came in shallow gasps, each one feeling like a struggle. I looked around, frantic, but the room had changed. The edges were blurring now, the stone walls fading into something darker, more foreboding. The floor beneath me felt spongy, as if the building itself had turned into something alive. No, this can't be happening. I felt the fear rising within me again, the panic clawing at my throat. But this time, it was different. This was no longer just a building or a shadow. It was something ancient, something that had existed long before I had ever come to this forsaken place. It was not a haunting. This was a warning. The whispers grew louder now, a cacophony that seemed to pierce my very mind. It's too late. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. My limbs felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else. I could only stare helplessly as the shadow drew closer, the darkness swirling around me like a storm, a whirlpool of despair that threatened to consume me whole. The figure in the shadow seemed to grow more distinct now. The eyes, if they could even be called eyes, burned with a cold, empty fire. I could feel the emptiness in them, the hollow space of something long dead, something that no longer belonged to this world. "This place will be your tomb," it whispered. "This place has claimed others. It will claim you too." I couldn't speak. I could barely think. The air had grown thicker, heavier, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down, pushing me into the ground. It was as though the room itself had become alive, its walls closing in on me like the jaws of a beast, the ceiling lowering toward me like an inevitable execution. Suddenly, I felt it. A cold, clammy hand, brushing against the back of my neck. A touch so cold it froze my very skin, sinking deep into my bones. I gasped, my breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. "No, please, please." The shadow flickered, the form shifting rapidly, like it was pulsing with every heartbeat, moving closer. But then, as if it were just a figment of my mind, it paused. A silence fell over the room, so deep that it felt like the world had stopped. No whispers, no wind, no breath, only the cold weight of waiting. And then it spoke. "Do you know where you are?" I shuddered. The voice was not human. It was beyond anything I could comprehend, ancient and powerful, a voice that had not been heard in eons. "This is not a place you can leave." The walls shook, the ground trembled beneath me, and I knew in that moment the terrible truth. I was not just trapped, I was caught, and there was no escape. Chapter 8. The Unseen Hand. The oppressive silence hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Even the slightest movement felt like a betrayal of the quiet, as though the walls themselves would tighten their grip at the sound of a footstep or a breath. There were no more whispers, no more signs of the sinister force that had once surrounded me. Yet I knew that it was still there, watching, waiting. The room, which had once been dark and menacing, had shifted. It was as though the very atmosphere had been redefined, its dimensions warping with each breath I took. The flickering light from the overhead bulb was now steady, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch further than they should, as though the space had grown larger, unhinged from the natural laws of time and place. I had made a choice. There was no turning back now. After everything that had happened, after the sight of that shadow, that twisted, maddening smile, I could no longer ignore the truth. The truth was simple, though horrifying in its implications. I wasn't alone here. I had never been alone. The sensation crept slowly at first, like an itch in the back of my mind, easily dismissed at first as a figment of my tired brain. But now, as I stood in the center of the room, the air seemed to ripple around me, distorting and bending as though it were alive. The shadows from the walls seemed to gather around me like 1,000 unseen eyes, watching, waiting, anticipating my every movement. A distant thudding noise echoed through the walls, low and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something vast and ancient. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place, my mind screaming at me to flee, but my feet refused to obey. It was as if the room itself had gained a hold on me, a gravitational force that kept me rooted in place. The thudding grew louder, now accompanied by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like a voice, just out of reach, calling my name. I tried to move, but my body betrayed me. Every movement felt like I was wading through thick, sticky mud. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, rippling as though it were not solid at all, but some sort of gelatinous substance that threatened to swallow me whole. No, I thought. This can't be real. But the walls closed in, slow and steady, until I could feel the pressure on my chest, as though they were compressing my lungs with each passing second. The air grew colder, and the temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that my breath became visible, a thin mist rising from my mouth. I glanced around, desperately searching for some way out, but there was nothing. No door, no window, just four walls closing in around me like the jaws of a giant, waiting to crush me under its weight. The darkness at the edges of the room began to bleed inward, shifting and crawling like an invasive force that would not be denied. It seemed to move with purpose, with intention, creeping closer, wrapping itself around me like a shroud. "You should have never come here." The voice spoke again, louder now, and it sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was as if a chorus of whispers had joined together, each word curling through the air like a sickening breeze. I could feel the weight of those words pressing down on me, the threat in them unmistakable. My heart raced, and for a moment I was paralyzed by the sheer force of the terror that gripped me. "You were never meant to leave." I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to acknowledge the truth in those words. But I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop the panic, the overwhelming sense that I was being drawn into something far darker, far older than anything I had ever encountered. The walls seemed to throb with a heartbeat now, the pulsing rhythm matching the thudding noise that had been growing louder and louder. I could feel my chest tightening with every beat, the air becoming heavier and harder to breathe. And then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the darkness that had enveloped the room, was moving toward me. It was a shape, a presence, indistinguishable from the surrounding blackness. But it was there. I could feel it, feel the coldness that radiated from it, feel the unnatural pull it had on my soul. It was as though it was drawing me in, reeling me toward it with invisible strings. I reached out instinctively, desperate to stop it, but my hand passed right through it, the sensation cold and numbing as though I had dipped it into ice water. I recoiled, but the shadow didn't stop. It continued to move toward me, slow and deliberate. And then I heard it, the voice again, but this time it was clear. It was in my head. "It's too late. You're already ours." The shadow began to shift and change, its form contorting and twisting in unnatural ways. I could see faces now, faces that weren't quite human, but not entirely alien either. They were distorted, grotesque, their eyes wide and unblinking, their mouths gaping open in silent screams. The faces seemed to flicker and fade, only to be replaced by more endless faces that seemed to scream in silence. It was then that I realized I wasn't just seeing these faces. I was hearing them. They were inside my head, their cries echoing within my mind, their voices becoming one with my thoughts. "Let go," they whispered in unison. "Let go, and we will take you." I didn't want to let go. I didn't want to succumb to whatever was happening, but I could feel the pull of it. It was like a gravitational force, drawing me closer to the heart of the shadow, pulling me into the depths of its twisted embrace. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat constricted, and the coldness of the room pressed in on me like an iron vice. The faces in the shadow flickered again, and I realized this was no longer a room. It was a prison, a trap, a place where time had stopped, and where the darkness had consumed everything it could. The walls, once solid, began to melt, warping and shifting like liquid, flowing into the ground, into the very air I breathed. The shadow pulsed with life, and I could feel myself being pulled into it, my body no longer my own. I tried to fight it, tried to push back against the force, but my limbs felt numb, heavy, like they didn't belong to me. I was being taken, and in that moment, I knew I wasn't going to survive this. Whatever this place was, whatever force had summoned me here, I was its victim. There would be no escape, no rescue. And then, the voices stopped. The faces vanished. The room, the shadow, everything faded away. It was as though I had never existed at all. The room grew silent once more. The last traces of my presence faded into the blackness. The walls, the air, the very space around me returned to stillness, to nothingness. It was as if everything that had happened had never been. It was as if I had never been. And as the final remnants of my existence melted away into the abyss, I realized something horrifying. I hadn't just been taken. I had become part of it, part of the void. This section continues to build on the atmosphere of entrapment, suffocation, and loss. The protagonist is being drawn deeper into the malevolent force that haunts the space, but their struggle is futile against an entity far beyond their comprehension. Feel free to adjust or expand upon this beginning, and continue weaving the story in the direction that fits your vision for the narrative. Chapter 9. The Hollow Whisper. The night seemed to breathe with an unnatural rhythm, like the deep, slow exhalation of something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching, for an eternity. Each breath carried with it the chill of an endless winter, each exhale twisting the air, warping it, distorting reality itself. The house, once a sanctuary, had become something else entirely, something malevolent, hungry, and unyielding. The walls, once solid and comforting, now felt as if they were made of skin. The house was alive, pulsing, breathing. A heartbeat, faint but discernible, echoed through the floors and walls, reverberating within my skull. The darkness itself seemed to crawl, inching closer with every passing moment. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the faintest traces of something foul and stagnant. It filled my nostrils, stinging my lungs with its rancid bitterness. I stumbled through the halls, my steps slow and unsteady. The house seemed to stretch, its dimensions changing with each turn. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me, or if the house itself was warping, shifting, turning into something unrecognizable. The wooden floors creaked beneath my feet, groaning as if they were complaining of their own weight, their own suffering. The air was so cold now that it cut through my clothes, leaving an ache in my bones that no warmth could touch. And then I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't the kind of whisper you hear when someone is speaking in the next room. It wasn't the soft murmur of the wind slipping through cracks in the windows. This whisper was different. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if it were woven into the very fabric of the house, wrapping itself around my consciousness like an insidious vine. "You're not alone," it murmured, its voice low and trembling with an eerie resonance that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The voice wasn't my own, wasn't anyone I knew. It was too ancient, too distant. It felt as if it had been carried on the wind through the ages, settling within the walls of this accursed place. A sudden coldness gripped my throat, as though something invisible was choking me. I gasped for breath, struggling to fill my lungs, but the air seemed to grow thinner, heavier with each passing second. The shadows around me deepened, stretching and writhing like living things, licking the edges of my vision. The whisper came again, closer this time. "They're waiting." I spun around, but there was nothing but the cold, suffocating blackness pressing in on me. The light, weak and flickering, seemed to bend and pulse with each heartbeat, as if it were alive too. My eyes darted from corner to corner, but I could find no source for the whisper. It felt like it was inside my mind now, a constant, gnawing presence that refused to be ignored. "They're waiting for you to join them." The floor beneath me shifted again, groaning as though it were alive, as though it were trying to speak. The sensation of being watched grew unbearable. I could feel eyes on me, countless eyes, hidden in the dark recesses of the house, their gaze pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't escape it. I moved forward, each step feeling like I was wading through thick, sticky mud. I wanted to turn back, to flee from the house, but something, the house, wouldn't let me. My legs felt heavy, as though they were no longer my own. The walls seemed to bend inwards, twisting, turning, constricting the very space around me, and the whispering, God, the whispering, was growing louder. "Come to us, come closer. You'll see them all." I wasn't sure if the voice was taunting me or offering some kind of mercy. It didn't matter. I was drawn in, like a moth to the flame, unable to stop myself. I reached the center of the hall, the place where the house seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The shadows here were thick, alive, and moving in ways that defied logic. They were too dark, too thick to be mere reflections. They seemed to breathe, And then, slowly, they began to take shape. At first, it was only a silhouette, a figure standing in the darkness, just at the edge of my vision. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body shrouded in shadow, its face hidden in the depths of the blackness that clung to it like a veil. My breath caught in my throat and the air grew heavier, colder, suffocating. "Come closer, child," the voice whispered again, this time unmistakably coming from the figure, though its lips never moved. I stepped forward, my legs trembling, my heart pounding in my chest, but I could not stop myself. It was as if my body no longer belonged to me. The house, the shadows, the whispers, they were all pulling me in. The figure in the shadows stirred, its body moving in jerking, unnatural motions. It seemed to glide, its limbs stretched impossibly long, its presence like a stain on the fabric of reality itself. I could feel it. Feel the weight of its gaze, its hunger. I could feel its malice pressing down on me, suffocating me. "You're just like the others. You'll be part of us." The words slithered into my ears like a venomous snake, curling and coiling inside my mind, poisoning my thoughts. I could feel my skin crawl, my heart racing as the figure drew closer, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. The darkness around it seemed to bend and twist, pulling away from it like a cloak, revealing more of the grotesque figure beneath. Its face, when I finally saw it, was not a face at all. It was a collection of swirling, shifting shadows, a patchwork of shapes that didn't quite fit together. There were eyes, countless eyes, floating in the abyss of its face, blinking in erratic, disturbing rhythms. Its mouth was a gaping maw, too wide to be human, its teeth jagged and crooked like broken bones. And in that mouth, a scream, endless and terrible, broke free, echoing in my mind, searing through my thoughts like a fire. The sound was maddening, deafening, and for a moment, I thought I might lose my mind entirely. "Join us," the voice whispered, now louder, more insistent. "Join us, and you will never have to leave." The figure reached out, its long, skeletal hand grasping for mine. I tried to pull away, but my body refused to respond. My hand stretched forward, trembling, drawn to the dark, the void, the promise of something beyond. And then, as I stood there, caught between the living and the dead, between reality and the unknown, I heard something else. Something familiar, a voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable, calling my name. "No!" Chapter 10. The Endless Echo. The house had never truly been silent. From the moment I stepped inside, it had whispered, moaned, and groaned like something ancient, restless, and unwilling to let go. I had learned that in the days that had blurred together since I first walked into its cursed halls. But now, the silence had grown louder than anything I had ever heard. I had thought myself prepared for what I would find in this place. This house that seemed to defy the very laws of time and space. But nothing had prepared me for this. The whispers had turned into full voices, their tones rising and falling like the tide, crashing against the shores of my mind. The house itself was no longer a mere structure. It was a living, breathing thing, and I was trapped inside it, caught in its malevolent embrace. As I moved deeper into the house, each room felt like a trap. Each turn I took felt like a new chapter in a nightmare, each shadow cast in the corners more menacing than the last. The walls seemed to pulse, their surfaces slick with some unnamable substance, as if the house was sweating, exhaling its own despair. The air felt thick, as though it had been poisoned by years of sorrow, regret, and malevolence. My own breath felt ragged, uneven, as if the air had become too heavy to take in. I tried to push the fear away, telling myself that it was all in my head, that the house could not truly be alive, could not truly be watching me. But deep down, I knew better. The eyes were everywhere now. They had started small, faint, fleeting glimpses of something watching from the corners of my vision, quick and quiet. But now they were impossible to ignore. Everywhere I looked, there was something, someone, watching me. Their eyes followed my every movement, their gaze cold and unfeeling. They stared without blinking, without expression, as if they had been there for centuries, waiting for me. And then, The voice came again. "It's time." The whisper was so soft, so quiet, that I almost missed it. But it was there, faint and delicate, like the rustle of dead leaves in a forgotten forest. It was calling me, urging me to go further into the house, into the heart of its darkness. I had to follow. I had no choice. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly before me, each door a passage into something worse than the last. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, what I was hoping for, but it certainly wasn't this. Behind each door, there was nothing but emptiness. At first, I thought it was just the dim lighting, the decay that had set in over time. But no, there was something else, an oppressive force, a weight that pressed down on me, pushing me deeper into despair. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows thickening with every step I took. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling. It was cold, colder than it should have been. I could feel the chill biting into my skin, as though the metal itself were alive. I pulled the door open slowly, careful not to make a sound. The air that rushed out from the room was fetid, rancid, thick with the scent of rot and decay. Inside, the room was dark, almost too dark. But there was something in the center, a shape, a figure that didn't belong in the world of the living. It stood, motionless, in the center of the room, its body covered in shadows, its form vaguely human, but distorted, twisted in ways that defied nature. The figure didn't move. It didn't breathe. It didn't even seem to exist in the way that I did. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I could not see its face. There was a weight to its gaze, as though it was pulling me into itself. Slowly, inevitably, the room seemed to stretch, the walls pressing closer and closer, the air thickening until I couldn't breathe. I tried to turn away, but my legs felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the floor. The shadows wrapped around me, tugging at me, pulling me into the center of the room. And then, from the depths of the darkness, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come." It wasn't the voice from before, the one that had taunted me, beckoned me forward. This voice was different. It was cold, flat, as though it had been stripped of all emotion, all humanity. It was a voice that belonged to the dead. The figure moved then, its arms stretching out, reaching toward me, its fingers long and skeletal, like claws that scraped across the air. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadows closed in around me, thickening, pressing down, suffocating me. And then, in that moment, I saw it. The thing that stood before me wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just a creature. It was a memory, one that had been twisted, distorted, and brought to life in this house. It was a soul that had been trapped here, trapped for eternity, and now it was calling to me, begging me to join it. "You shouldn't have come," the voice repeated louder now, as if it were a warning, but it was too late. I had already stepped too far into the darkness. I had already crossed the line, and in that moment, I realized that the house, this cursed, accursed house, was not just haunted. It was alive. Alive with the souls of those who had come before me. Alive with the memories of the dead, twisted into something dark, something hungry. And now, it was waiting for me to join them.